just be different. Don't try to be better. Don't accept being less. Focus on being different.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful day today. My name is Talal, and you are listening to the Popcorn and Soda Podcast, the show where we discuss all things movies, pop culture, and so much more. I want to thank each and every one of you for making me a small part of your day. On today's show, we're joined by a very special guest. He is one of the most influential men in the history of professional wrestling. He helped revolutionize the medium in the 90s by expanding World Championship Wrestling to a broader global audience by integrating popular culture and film-like storylines at the peak of the ratings war in the 90s. On the show today, New York Times bestseller, host of the acclaimed 83 Weeks podcast, and the latest inductee to the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2021, Mr. Eric Bischoff. How are you, Eric?
Talal, I am just outstanding, particularly after such an amazing introduction. Thank you very much.
Hey, no, my pleasure. And thank you so much for coming to hang out on the show today, Eric. How have you been over this last year? We're living in such a crazy world right now. What did 2020 look like for Eric Bischoff?
2020 was great for me. And I don't say that without recognizing and being aware that for a lot of people around the world, in this country, that was not the case. I happen to live in the least populated state in the United States, the state of Wyoming, which geographically is about the same size as Colorado, but has probably fewer people. There's 500,000 people in the whole state of Wyoming. Wow. So it's probably fewer people that live in whatever county you live in, Talal. So it's, I'm in a socially distant state, but most of the people that live here choose to be socially distant. So it didn't really affect us like it did so many other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's definitely been a tough time for a lot of people. And here's to hoping that hopefully the tail end of 2021 may be a bit better than what 2020 was for a lot of people.
Well, you know what, 2021 already feels a little bit better. We're starting to see, obviously with the vaccine coming out and testing becoming more sophisticated and readily available, all of the other things that have happened throughout 2020, I think now we're starting to see, the manifestation of some of the positive effort that went into those things. And people started to loosen up just a little bit.
Absolutely. So, hey, here's hoping to greener pastures. Eric, I'm part of a generation that grew up in the mid-90s where one of the biggest forms of media at the time was professional wrestling. Now, whether it be the WWE or WCW, ratings were at an all-time high. Merchandise sales were at an all-time high. And that's largely due to you, Eric. Being a content creator in the year 2021 myself, I often find myself looking back at people that inspired me and helped shape my life and my love of creative arts. Where does this all begin for you, Eric, especially your love of content creation? What was your first influence that made you want to get into this industry?
Fascination, a desire to learn. But really, I'm 65 years old. So as a young kid growing up in Detroit and my family had limited means, like so many of the people in my neighborhood, so many people that were living in Detroit at the time, we were on the lower end of the economic spectrum, if you will. But television was like the center of our family universe. It's the thing that brought us together every night after dinner. And it's what we shared. It was the communal event, of our day-to-day life. And there was only 3 channels, right? Well, there was a local access channel, but for the most part, there were only 3 choices to make. And all 3 choices in the evenings were, pretty much the same. And a lot of it was, Westerns. And at a very early age, I became fascinated with the storytelling and the characters. I didn't know I was fascinated with the storytelling. I didn't know I was being, fascinated by the characters, but it drew me in. Because it was another world. It was another life. It was so different than the life that I was living. than the geography that I experienced. So it's just my fascination with television. And then you fast forward, to my first job in television, which was basically in sales in an administration capacity for Vern Gagne and the AWA. But because of the access and proximity, I was able to kind of finally discover how they got all of those images and those sounds into that tiny little box that was the center of my family's universe, Monday through Friday. And I got to learn how television was actually produced and distributed. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And the more I learned, after learning more, the more hungry I became to learn even more. So it was like this vicious appetite to learn more. And as I started getting a feel for things, then I think my entrepreneurial kind of instinct dovetailed into it, and poof, off we went.
And you just took the next question right out of my mouth. One thing that fascinates me so much about you, Eric, is what you just mentioned right now. And that's your love of TV and film. You're very outspoken about how you really study the 3-act concept of film and television. Now, what resonates you so much about that medium specifically and having that great beginning, middle, and end?
Well, I mean, I've always had that instinct, right? I didn't study film. I didn't study literature. I am essentially a formally uneducated, or formally, not formerly, but formally
Right.
Uneducated person when it comes to storytelling and film. But I'm a consumer and I know what I like. And there's a lot of access to information and a lot of things to listen to and read that allowed me to get, better understand the theory, the practical application of formal storytelling in literature and in other forms of entertainment, and not selectively, but being able to recognize the elements of some of those formulas that really apply to the form of entertainment that I've spent 30 years in. And it allowed me to kind of create a model, at least in my own head, of how to tell great stories in wrestling, or how great stories are being told in some cases, how potentially great stories aren't great stories because of what they're not doing based on kind of traditional storytelling formulas. So it's just a fascination, much like wanting to know how they got those pictures and that sound in that little box. I've just kind of evolved into wanting to learn about how great stories can be and should be told in the formulas required in professional wrestling. So it's kind of a hobby / passion / profession, I guess.
We'll go with that. Now, you speak about the formula. And sometimes people say, hey, well, there's no formula to film or TV. Either you like it or you don't. But there's a lot of very similar threads, a lot of different methods that great directors and great filmmakers used to create great stories. Now, you were the president of WCW in the 90s, where wrestling, again, as I mentioned, was one of the hottest things, one of the hottest forms of media where consumers were glued to their televisions watching it. Now, did you find something personally in that period where you're like, I think there's something missing in the landscape of having these cinematic style stories where, as again, someone like Sting or Goldberg, or more importantly, the NWO, there's very specific formulas and constructs of those stories. What did you find in the landscape of television at the time that made you want to implement those concepts?
Great question, Talal. And for me, it started in about, I think it was 95. No, it's probably 1996. No, it was not, definitely 1996. I remember that because during the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, my company, Turner Broadcasting, WCW, we were based in Atlanta. And the majority of our crew, our production crew that was responsible for producing Nitro, our primary show at the time on TNT, they were employees of Turner Broadcasting, more specifically Turner Sports, right? So in 96, most of that crew, those people familiar with our product that were, had learned how to shoot professional wrestling, because producing professional wrestling is different than producing other forms of entertainment or even sports. It's a completely different animal. And all of our crew was gone. They were all assigned to the Olympics because the Olympics took precedence over WCW, just the way it was. And there were very few freelance crews available on the market, because anybody that was a halfway decent freelancer in production had a gig for the Olympics. Yeah. So we were forced to go down to, not forced is the wrong way of saying it, but we were left with no options other than to go down to the Disney MGM studios and produce our live Nitro on their lot. And while I was down there, because it was the height of Olympics and I was kind of sequestered into Orlando at the Disney MGM studios, I picked up a newspaper one day and I read an article. Dick Ebersol was being in, and Dick Ebersol famously, I think he was with ABC or NBC sports, kind of looked upon as like the guy in sports television. In an article, somebody asked him, what he was going to do to make the Winter Olympics more entertaining, to grow that audience. It was a fascinating article because Ebersol kind of described the elements that he was going to bring, that were new elements that he was going to not only bring to the Winter Olympics, but to really emphasize. And I looked at that, I went, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Ebersol talked a lot about story in that article and the importance of story over the actual athletic competition itself. I went, wow, that makes sense. That kind of applies to wrestling. And there were other elements like that. And then I plugged in some of my own because of the unique nature of wrestling and what it is compared to a drama or a comedy or a documentary or a sport. Right. So I started kind of creating my own, and I walked away with an acronym called SARSA: story, anticipation, reality, surprise, and action. Those to me were the 5 elements that really, really made the genre of television that I was producing at the time really work. And I began to look at everything that I did from, especially the NWO. That was really the test pattern, if you will, right? The prototype. But I really applied that theory, that acronym SARSA, to almost everything that we did early on in the NWO. In terms of the way we presented the interviews, in terms of the way we shot some of the footage, using black and white instead of color. Nobody was doing that. Nobody had shot anything in wrestling in black and white since 1967. But I brought back that black and white, grainy film noir kind of feel to some of it, because I wanted to change the vibe. I wanted to change the energy and make it unique. So it was just learning as I was going. I joke about it, but it's not a joke. It's true. I was just learning on the job.
Yeah, and absolutely. And as you mentioned, what was the prototype is also in many ways the crowning jewel of WCW, the NWO. And that acronym that you just mentioned there, but tied with that formula that you were talking about, how there's certain ways to get an audience reaction. NWO was the thing in the 90s. You can put that up there, DX. And in many ways, NWO did that before DX, where you really took that formula. And you took the formula of the 3-act film in many ways, where you had first act, you had the outsiders coming in. In many ways, the second act was, hey, who's the third man? And then you had Hulk Hogan come in and just poof, end of the movie, the villain wins. When you were breaking this down to some of the higher executives at Turner, were they on board with it? Or were they kind of like, Eric, what are you talking about?
I didn't run it by anybody. I just did it. I was really fortunate at the time because it was a different time, in today's universe, the way television is being done and the networks that produce it, you have layers and layers and layers of executives who are charged with kind of approving and chiming in on ideas. And I want to be careful how I say this. The vast majority of them suck at their jobs. The vast majority of them, isn't that nice? I actually spent a second trying to figure out a way to say it nice, and that was as good as I can get.
We'll take
They're
it.
fear-based, they're risk adverse, they
Right.
live in a cover your ass mentality. And it's because of the nature of the industry. It's a very carnivorous, I mean, the television industry today is much, much different than it was, back in the 90s. And I was in a position as the president of the company, I didn't have to ask permission. Occasionally I had to ask forgiveness, but I got good at that. But before we go to I want to go back to something that you said, and you were kind of paraphrasing what others have said about, oh, you don't need a formula. It's either good or it's bad.
Right.
That's so. Here I go again. It's Sunday. I'm going to be kind. I just don't disagree with it. I just don't agree with that. I
Yeah.
couldn't disagree with that more strongly. I've always felt that, but the more now, because I have more time on my hands and I'm more interested in different things today than I was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And learning is I get to spend more time learning about stuff. And for the last several years, I've, again, been studying basic storytelling and the application thereof in my world and all that kind of stuff we already talked about. But I read a book by Joseph Campbell called The Hero's Journey. And you read that book and it's like, oh my, this is so simple. Now, there's still art. It's the way you apply that formula and the nuance and the talent
Right.
and the magic. But everything has a formula. And I read that book. And again, it was kind of like the Dick Ebersol article. I was starting to steal shit out of that book that I knew would work for me, right? And if I was ever to write wrestling again or anything else for that matter. But in addition to that, because I began to become more interested in formula in entertainment, I actually signed up for an online comedy class. Not because I'm funny, nor do I really want to be, but I wanted to understand the process of writing comedy. Where do those ideas come from? Are people just inherently funny people? Some are and some aren't. And if you happen to be an inherently funny person, you probably maybe potentially end up, being Jerry Seinfeld, because everybody knows Jerry Seinfeld. He came out of the chute funny. He made the nurses laugh.
Right.
And he's been making people laugh his whole life because he was born funny. No, he wasn't born funny. And if you read about Jerry Seinfeld and the way he approaches writing for comedy, you would know that if there is ever a better example of why formulas work, Jerry Seinfeld is that definition. And the way he approaches the formula and approaches writing, you don't just wake up with a funny joke in your head. It's a work in progress every day,
Right.
hours and hours and hours a day. But when you begin to understand the formula, and the formula is now working for you, because if you're writing comedy, there are certain triggers, there are certain ways of telling a joke or telling a story that you can predictably get the audience to react when you want them to react within the context of said story or joke. And once you understand that formula, some of that applies to other forms of entertainment. And anyway, I just, for those people who subscribe to the theory that it either comes naturally or it is or it isn't, and you just let the flow, whatever, good for you. But I'm going to go with a guy like Jerry Seinfeld every time.
Hey, all the writing on the walls there, the success is there. Proof is there that putting in the time and effort day in, day out, you are going to get better at things. Your reaction time gets better. Your understanding of how the human mind and what a human being is attracted to in their daily lives. And sometimes we all just want to escape from the daily grind of work and just get lost in this immersive experience that is entertainment. What was so special about the 90s? And it's something that I think I've grown to really appreciate as I get older in my second part of my 20s is rewatching some of this stuff. Because when I was a kid and me and my brothers are sitting down watching it, we just love, the flashy colors, we love the characters, but understanding the in-ring psychology, understanding the overall scope of some of these stories. I look back at it and I apply so much of that to my everyday life as a content creator in 2021, where, as you mentioned, there is a formula. And that comes with a lot of trial and error, especially as you mentioned, the more you do it and the more you practice it, the better you get at it. Now, I want to apply that formula you just mentioned to the character of Eric Bischoff on screen. Not Eric Bischoff, the man that we're talking about right now, but that smug, leather jacket wearing, NWO shirt, sleeves rolled up. How much of that formula did you apply to that character specifically, and even more so to the NWO at its peak?
Well, the formula for me is more about the arc of a story than it is about the definition of a character.
Mhm.
Now, some of those elements of SARSA, story, anticipation, reality, surprise, and action, some of those elements can definitely apply to the building of a character. In fact, maybe arguably they all can, but in a slightly different way than I originally discussed it. But for me, a lot of it, and again, a lot of my journey, I guess, if you want to call it that, as a character, the evolution of Eric Bischoff as a television character happened kind of organically. You know, that story started a long time before I was ever in a position to write myself onto television as a central character or one of the central characters. And my journey, I mean, it literally was a perfect act one. Young man sitting in an office, happened to have a sport coat and a tie. No one else in the building did at the time. All of a sudden he gets introduced into a whole new world that he'd never been in before. That would be me coming out of my office, going to do interviews for the very first time on camera when I had no idea what the hell I was doing. That's my act one. I'm just walking around minding my own business, and I'm plucked out of one world and plopped down into a middle of another world that was completely alien to me. That is a classic kind of act one setup.
Yeah.
And the beginning of a journey. And that journey kind of watched me fail, stumble, fall, take a lot of criticism in the process, keep going until I was actually almost adequate at my job and loving every minute of it, even though I pretty much sucked. But I was okay. I was good enough to get by, you know, particularly for the money that I was being paid at the time. They couldn't afford anybody more expensive, so I was doing okay. And then, you know, my act two was getting a bigger and better opportunity. Obviously in WCW as an on-camera personality, you know, at the peak of act two, I'm all of a sudden running the company that hired me as a third string announcer. Now I'm running the entire company, and now I'm going to turn the entire wrestling industry upside down. Man, if that's not a classic act two, I don't know what is. So my story, my real story, I was in the middle of act two before I started thinking about what an act should be, or what the next act should be, or what a formula should be. But by the time I did 96, 97 primarily, by the time 1997 came along, the storyline, the arc, if you will, of the NWO story made it easy for me to integrate the SARSA formula with surprise. One of the key elements, anticipation is one, or they're all important, but anticipation is one of the key elements in my opinion, and so is surprise. Mm-hmm. And I was able to go, oh, how do I surprise my audience within the context of the story that's already unfolding? What would be a really shocking moment? I know. Everybody knows I'm the president of WCW. I was the first one attacked by the NWO. I was power bombed off a stage. Everybody would assume that I'm anti-NWO. Oh, hell no, I'm going to join them. Boom, off we went. But again, I think that's a perfect example. And that wasn't something that I planned. It was something that happened that I was able to go, okay, that worked. Now let's repeat that formula. Not repeat the story, but repeat the formula. And here's my belief, Talal, is if there's anybody out there in the wrestling industry that's listening to this, that's in the business of producing or writing it, you know, there is a formula that you could put down on paper that would be like a chemistry formula or a blueprint, an architectural blueprint to build a building, if you will. But there is a formula that you could create that would allow you to plug whatever story somebody comes up with, whatever ideation of a journey or a story or a conflict that somebody comes up with, you could plug that into the formula, and it would help you identify the beats along the way in the arc that you have to hit. You can't skip them. If you want the formula, if you want the story to succeed, you have to adhere as closely as possible to the formula. Knowing the formulas can change, by the way, or stories can change because of things that are out of your control. You have to, especially in wrestling, because of injuries and all that. But if you stick to the formula and you use it as your guide, instead of one story out of 100 hitting and sticking to the wall and generating tens of millions of dollars, or in the case of NWO, hundreds of millions of dollars, instead of that happening once, in every 100 or 1,000 times, maybe you can do it 10 out of 100. Or what if you started batting 250? My God, you're printing money and legacy and making great entertainment in whatever it is you do. So that's okay, I'm going to quit talking about it. I'm sorry.
No, that's an amazing insight, Eric. And especially for anyone in the entertainment industry, even not necessarily in the entertainment industry, you can apply a formula to your everyday life that can help you get to point A to point B, then to point C. And some of those insights that you just brought up were just so fascinating. I want to shift gears into the global strategy of WCW at the time of its peak. Now, I'm proof of the influence of this brand. I grew up in Pakistan and in the Middle East when I was a little kid, glued to my TV watching wrestling. My brothers and I, we had all the toys, we had all the merchandise, we had everything. And one thing that I'm so fascinated with today, as I'm in another chapter of my life and my journey in my arc and in my formula, when you're creating content during the peak of WCW, do you create it for a global audience? Or is it sometimes as simple as, hey, make the best television, make the best writing, make the best characters that you can, and the people will follow?
It would be the latter. And part of that is because we didn't have a choice. When you're producing content for one of the top cable outlets in the United States during prime time, that's very valuable real estate. I had 2 hours of Malibu beachfront property every Monday night at 8 p.m. And in order to get a return on the investment for that property that I was renting, I had to generate as many viewers and as much advertising as I could, because advertising is what made that donut work. If the advertising wasn't there, the beachfront property would go away. So I was catering to a domestic US audience primarily. But if you go back and look at some of the things that I did, I nuanced my way initially, but it eventually became not so nuanced. I started appealing to a broader international audience by bringing, for example, a lot of the top stars on a consistent basis. Other people before me showcased them once or twice a year, superstars, top talent from Japan, for example. I didn't invent that. I just perfected it by not just bringing them in as a spectacle or a one-off experience, but by integrating that talent and their representation in Japan into the WCW narrative. By creating the cruiserweight division, which I created specifically so that it would allow me to bring, in a very organic way that made sense to a wrestling fan, I was able to bring in all this top talent from Mexico, because the luchador style of wrestling was so different than what the domestic US audience was used to seeing. Now, again, I didn't invent this stuff. Other people had used a lot, not a lot. Other people had used luchadors in kind of domestic content here and there, but I had a major global platform to play with and on. So by creating the cruiserweight division and bringing in this Hispanic talent, these luchadors and their unique culture and presentation of wrestling, and then doing it at the same time within the context of the cruiserweight division, now I'm introducing a Japanese audience or a Japanese flavor into my product. And then by emphasizing as many international, European talent, I brought guys over from Sweden, that were big, successful in Sweden. And I brought people in from England, and I brought people in from Germany, Alex Wright, the Wunderkind, I didn't name him, a young kid from Germany. All of that was done as a means to kind of present our product to a global audience, but doing it within the context of what worked as a domestic product. God, that was a long-winded answer for a simple question. I'm sorry.
No, but again, that's what we love about Eric. You get into the nitty-gritty of it, and that's so true because you really highlighted these wrestlers. It wasn't just an afterthought where, as you mentioned, some of these promotions were doing that at the time, but it wasn't necessarily. And even in WCW, of course, you had your heavyweights, you had the Hogans, you had the Macho Mans, you had the Kevin Nashes, but here's this alternate form of wrestling within the larger scope of WCW that attracted a whole different form of audience, a global audience. And it really is very innovative, especially in today's world where we look at modern wrestling and we see how the smaller athlete is, in many ways, the new prototype of a professional wrestling. Now, before we deep dive into the modern day wrestling, looking back at the history of WCW and the legacy of WCW, what's one thing or a couple of things that you really take away from it and how that impacted the global scale of professional wrestling, especially with content creation?
There's only one real takeaway that I think is not going to change. I don't think anybody could change my mind about the way I feel about this. I am absolutely convinced that by being forced, and by the way, I was forced. I didn't ask to go head to head against WWE. I didn't ask for a prime time, Monday night television time slot. I was charged with the responsibility by Ted Turner himself, not somebody that worked for Ted Turner. Ted himself said, go do this. And when the words were coming out of Ted's mouth and I was actually registering what it really meant, sitting in front of him in his office, I was in a sheer state of panic because I didn't know how to do what he wanted me to do. I had no idea. I had never thought about doing it before. The thought would have never crossed my mind. There was not enough weed in a big enough bong for me to get high enough to even allow that thought to form in my head, so to speak. So I walked out of there and I knew the only thing that I could do was be different than. I knew I couldn't be better than the WWE. I couldn't. I knew I couldn't be less than the WWE because that would mean I'd be out of a job. So because of the opportunity that Ted had just given me. So I knew the only answer I had was to be different. And I focused on different in every way I possibly could. I made a list. I literally, within 2 hours of leaving that meeting, I locked myself in my office, unplugged my phone with a yellow legal pad and a pen. And I made a list of all the ways that I could be different than the current WWE at the time product was. And it was that list and the decision I made to be different than, not better than. That's a mistake I think too many people make when they create content. I want to do it better than he does or she does. No, you want to do it different. And if you do it different enough and you're good, you'll be better. But if you focus on copying somebody else's formula or using somebody else's idea and trying to do it better, you probably won't, especially if they've been around a long time. But if you look at something you really, really like and say, man, I really love that, but I got to figure out a different way to do that, chances are you got a shot. So it's being different, man. That's the one thing I take away. Just be different. Don't try to be better. Don't accept being less. Focus on being different.
It's beautiful. Amazing words of wisdom from Eric Bischoff himself. Now, transitioning over to modern day wrestling. And I'd be a fool not to ask one of the geniuses of the industry about the current state of wrestling. Now, there's been this boom of professional wrestling in the last 5, 6 years. We have All Elite Wrestling, New Japan Pro Wrestling, NXT, WWE. What is the state of wrestling in 2021, Eric?
I think from a macro perspective, it's never been healthier. If you look at, the professional wrestling, the televised professional wrestling footprint, and by that I include streaming. But if you look at that footprint globally, it has never been bigger and deeper around the world than it is today, ever, 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 ever. If you look at the amount of money, of revenue that the industry is generating today, it's never, ever, ever been bigger. If you look at the sheer number of individuals who are able to make a living inside of this industry, and people who are behind the scenes, writers and producers. I dare say it's probably never, ever been better.
It's true.
So there's a lot of reasons to be really excited and optimistic about the state of the industry right now. But there's also, I guess, like anything, some potential issues. And I think to a degree, the success, primarily WWE, but in addition, AEW, Ring of Honor, Impact Wrestling, all the others that you mentioned, and some that'll probably be around, next week that we haven't heard of before, they're becoming victims of their own success. And I experienced that when I was running hard in 97, 96, 97, 98. When you become so big and you commit to creating more and more and more content because you're being successful and the cash register's turning over and you're happy and people around you are patting you on your back. And what's the one thing everybody wants to do? Keep growing, right?
Yeah.
And that's a healthy thing until it's not. And I think what I've seen, what I experienced, I'll just stick with my own experience without projecting it on others. When Nitro was bulletproof, we were bulletproof. We could do almost anything and get record ratings. That's how hot we were. It's like the Rolling Stones coming out with a new song. The song may suck, but people will still buy it and love it because it's from the Rolling Stones at that point.
Stones, yeah.
So we were kind of like that in our own weird, distant way. And then when Thunder came along, when Ted Turner said, "Oh, that's working so great, I'm going to see if I can be right twice," and same thing. I didn't get the vote. I didn't even get to say no. When Ted said, "Okay, now you're going to do an additional 2 hours. We know you're kicking ass over here on Monday night. Now you're going to do 2 hours over here on TBS on Thursday nights." That created a big burden. I wasn't producing twice as much content. I was producing 3.5 times as much content because I had the same infrastructure that I was now spreading out for 2 different shows. And the net effect of that, because I wasn't able, they wouldn't let me hire new producers. They wouldn't let me, there was a freeze on because of the Time Warner merger at the time, or pending Time Warner merger. So there was a real constriction of resources, including hiring people. So I had to make good with what I had. And the net effect was like producing 350% more content because everybody was spread so thin and the creative fatigue set in. So I think what's happening now, if you step back with that, that's my frame of reference. So if you look at the world through my eyes, based on my experience, I'm looking at WWE becoming so successful. They're making so much money in television licensing fees. It's beyond amazing to me. No one would have ever thought it would possible 15 years ago, 10 years ago. The amount of money, there's the rights for their streaming platform. You're looking at $1 billion from this guy and $1 billion from this network and $1 billion from this network.
NBC Peacock recently just acquired the rights to the WWE network in the United States.
Unheard of. But what's the net effect of that? They're going to have to create more content. They're going to have to fill that pipeline. And unfortunately, and this is not meant as a criticism, in a way, I kind of wish it was me, not kind of. What's happened is the pressure to keep cranking out that content has hurt the storytelling. Not because there's nobody there talented enough. Everybody there is talented enough and more than talented enough. When I say there, I mean WWE. But they're spread real thin. And they're doing a great job filling that pipeline. But I dare say that the quality of story has suffered as a result of the sheer volume and trajectory of the product. It's growing so fast and spreading so wide that something has to give. And I think that give is a little bit the story. The stories in WWE used to be so amazing. They used to start building for WrestleMania 6 months, 12 months in advance. You had, remember, Beginning of this
Of course.
story, anticipation. Story and anticipation was like the hallmark of everything that was WWF when it was WWF. You remember the stories. You remember why, Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant wrestled, or Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage. You remember the story as much as you remember the actual match. Actually, you remember the story more than you remember the match.
Of course.
Well, today the emphasis is now on the match. How high risk is it? How many high risk moves can someone do in a row? How athletic is it? How explosive is it? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not a hater. Okay. There are a certain school of people in my age category, predominantly, they just detest this style of wrestling that we see today. I don't. I dig it, but I want to see it with a story behind it. I don't want to see it just for the sake of seeing the athleticism. That's what Olympic ice skating is all about. Figure skating is all about. I'll watch that. Or gymnastics, I'll watch that. But if I want to watch story, please give me story. And I think that's what's suffering right now. And I think, look, everything is a pendulum. Politics, every culture, pop culture, everything kind of swings back and forth.
Right.
And I think we'll see that swing back to more storytelling as people that produce this stuff wake up and go, what's that story again? And why should I care? At that point, they'll start figuring it out and put more emphasis and resources and, dare I say, formula behind their storytelling efforts.
It's very interesting, Eric. So has wrestling gone too corporate in today's climate, in today's world, where, as you mentioned, there's so much content, and with the rise of streaming and with NBC Peacock just taking the rights to the WWE network in the stateside, and me in Canada, it's massive here on Sportsnet. Do you think that the art of professional wrestling is somewhere not even at the very top of the list for a company like WWE, which in many ways is becoming a Disney-like corporation where you've got shareholders, you've got a lot of people that got their money invested in this product? Is wrestling gone a little soft and become more corporate than ever before?
Our culture has gone, the industry, the entertainment industry is as corporate as, the banking system here in the United States. The entertainment industry is in and of itself an extremely corporate environment. So if you want to party in a corporate environment, you better dress for the occasion, and you have to be corporate. Or you don't have to be, you just don't get to play. You don't get invited to the party, and which means you're really, really popular in your hometown because you never make it to the main stage. So of course it's gotten more corporate as it's become more successful, like everything does. There will always be opportunities for independent wrestling, just like there is in the independent film industry or the independent television industry or the independent book writing industry, which is getting so large now because people can self-publish. You don't have to get by the corporate gatekeepers the way you used to in the publishing business. The same can be said for, different streaming platforms. But at the end of the day, if you want to serve your employees, and in the case of wrestling, your independent contractors, if you want to serve your fans and grow your audience and be financially successful, then you got to put on a pair of dress shoes, a white shirt, a red tie, and a blue suit, or don't. But you don't get to do it both ways.
Absolutely. So what's the metric in 2021 that pretty much sums up the success of a television show or a film, especially in wrestling? Because as you mentioned, wrestling's not the same as it was in the 90s, where ratings were such a massive indication of the success of a show. With streaming, social media, PVR, the numbers aren't there the way they once were. So how do you even measure the success of a show? Is it the amount of Instagram likes you get on a post, the amount of viewers you get on a YouTube video? In Eric Bischoff's mind, what's a strong indicator in 2021 of the success of your show?
The bottom line financially. It's the same thing that defines commercial success in anything. There's a lot of debate, discussion, promises, projections, and all kinds of analysis about how, Nielsen, for example, is going to, recalculate or restructure the way they calculate
Mhm.
streaming numbers and social media numbers. And there's going to be some formula that Nielsen, which by the way, I don't have a lot of confidence in them anyway. They've been freaking voodoo for a long time, but presumably I'm wrong. And there's going to be a formula that takes all of those things into consideration and can distill them down. And really, why do people do that? Why does Nielsen even exist? It exists so that advertisers, people that have products to sell, from Ford Motor Company to a beer
McDonald's.
company,
There we
any
go.
beer company. What's a popular beer in Canada again? I used to,
Coors
oh,
Light.
no, man, that's a U.S. Well, yeah, it is a
Bud
Canadian.
Light. How about let's get some Bud
Yeah,
Light in there? Bud Light,
yeah,
Molson
you guys
Canadian.
took over all the breweries. My God, it's
Molson
been
Canadian. How about that?
invasion.
Molson Canadian. That's a good
Molson,
Canadian brew.
Labatt's, isn't Labatt's yours?
Labatt. Yep.
All
Labatt's.
right,
That's one of
all
ours.
right.
Yeah.
So if the brewers of Labatt's want to advertise in a television show, any television show, or particularly a wrestling show, which would be nice if they did, you've got to deliver numbers. It's got to make sense financially. And that means it's incumbent upon you to grow your business. And we talked about earlier, be corporate, satisfy those advertisers, grow your business so you've got enough of them where you can appeal to those advertisers. That's the nature of the business. It's always going to be the nature of the business.
It's so true, Eric, because as you mentioned, the bottom line is what keeps these companies afloat. And especially when you have a publicly traded company like the WWE, there's a lot of people that have a lot on the line with these companies. Now, one thing I want to transition to is All Elite Wrestling. Now, I'm personally a big fan of AEW. We've gotten to see you there a couple of times. Eric Bischoff's big return back on a TNT. Before we dive into a couple nitty gritty about the company, how is it like being back on TNT in over 20 years for the first time?
The honest answer, Talal, is I didn't really think about at all the fact that I was coming back to TNT.
Oh,
It kind of
interesting.
occurred to me after social media hit. I went, oh, Eric Bischoff's back on TNT. And I went, oh, that's right. I guess I am. I forgot all about
Yeah.
that.
Tony
For,
Schiavone blurred that out the second you walked in.
yeah, but I
Eric
didn't hear
Bischoff's
it. Until,
back.
I didn't hear
Fair
it
enough.
until I was out there on the floor. I didn't hear it until I saw the social media clips, that night or the next day. So until I actually heard other people talking about that obvious fact, it just didn't really occur to me, to be honest. What did occur to me was, I got to be out there on camera. Jim Ross is a part of the show. Tony Schiavone's part of the show. That's taken me back to early 1990s.
Yeah.
That was the last time the three of us worked together. It's kind of a big damn deal. That really resonated with me. That the fact that Jim and Tony and I were there together. And oh, by the way, one of the producers of the show, the main producer of the show, is a cat by the name of Keith Mitchell, who I have a ton of respect for. He used to work for me in WCW. Half the people there, not half, that's exaggerating, a percentage of the people that worked on the production crew at AEW that night worked for me in WCW. That kind of became really, I was impressed by all that immediately, but the fact that I was on TNT didn't come till after the fact.
That's still a great moment for the fans, and especially when you see it now with like the dirt sheets and everything. For those who don't know what that is, it's just spoilers leaking online. It leaked a day or two, I think the day of, that Eric Bischoff's back on TNT. But for someone like myself who didn't actually read any of that, and I saw it, and I'm like, my mind just blew because it just automatically took me back to my childhood and seeing that guy with the leather jacket. He had a nice suit on and a tie this time, but hey, it brings you back to so many memories. Now, what I love
I
about
dug that leather jacket out the other day. I still have that. I still have one left.
That's again, the smugness, the rolled up sleeves. It doesn't get better than circa 90s Eric Bischoff. Jet black hair. Love it. Now, one thing I love about All Elite Wrestling is, in many ways, as we kind of talk about the contrast between a giant corporation that's been around for 50, 60 years in the WWE versus a newer promotion in All Elite Wrestling, is in many ways it's almost like a Deadpool kind of breaking the fourth wall, wink at the audience. I'm a big fan of Kenny Omega, the Box, Cody, but here's this theory that I have, and I kind of want to run it by someone who's been in the industry through the highs and the lows. Do you feel that there is a big missed opportunity during this last year during the pandemic? And again, I want to preface this with there's a lot of crazy things that were going on in the world at the time. We didn't really know what the virus really was, how it affects people. And end of the day, these wrestlers are human beings. They have families. They're still concerned about that rather than having wrestling in the top of their mind. Do you feel that there's a missed opportunity specifically with the ratings? Because you would naturally think that people are at home, they're having their phones with them more often than before, and they're going to be more likely to watch television. But the ratings didn't necessarily indicate that. Am I missing something, or do you feel that there was a missed opportunity there?
It's a really interesting and a smart observation. And you're right. One would think that with more people, I mean, people can't go out to bars, they can't go out to restaurants, they can't go to concerts, they can't go shopping in malls, they can't do anything. They can't visit their grandmother on Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
So they're kind of stuck in the house. One would suspect that because of the in Nielsen ratings, there's an acronym called HUT that's in there with the percentages and the demo breakdowns and all of that. But HUT stands for households using television. For example, in the summertime, when the weather's nice and the sun's up till 10 o'clock at night, the HUT levels go way down. People aren't in the house using television, right? Simple. And one would assume that, during COVID, the HUT levels would go way up, therefore viewing would go up. And it didn't, not in wrestling. And that's interesting. Now, the way I looked at that, because I did notice that, I was surprised by it. But I think the opportunity to grow the audience during COVID, that opportunity was there. It really, really was. But I think the reason that wrestling didn't grow during that period of time is because wrestling without an audience is just not interesting.
Yeah.
There's no energy.
True.
There's no passion. There's no vibe. There's no energy. There's just action for the sake of action. And when there's action for the sake of action with very little attention to real structural detail or formula with respect to the story, it means that the story isn't really there. You think it is, you're by default assuming you have a story because somebody laid it out and we're going to shoot this angle, we're going to do this and this, and then we're going to do a rematch. And, in the eyes of some, in the minds of some, that represents a story. It's not a story. It's just a series of presentations that don't really create any real emotion or intentionally create emotion that you can harness and manage and take all the way to the bank. You're just throwing shit up against the wall and hoping it sticks. And when you're throwing shit up against the wall and hoping it sticks, when there's no one in the audience to react to it, whether it sticks or doesn't, it's just not the same thing. And I think the reason that wrestling didn't grow during this period of time is because not having an audience really, really hurt the product in general. If it, by some, form of magic, you would have been able to have audiences in wrestling, you would have been able to give them a vaccination, and they were test monkeys, if you will, and they all got to get vaccinations so they could all come to wrestling. And those same people came every week and they were huge fans. I think wrestling would have gone through the roof, but it didn't. You were now wrestling in front of empty arenas, eventually, because of the amazing job that WWE did with their virtual audience. Now you've got something that kind of represents an audience and something that kind of represents energy. You're about a third of the way there, but not all the way there. Well, even a third of the way was pretty freaking good, during COVID. But AEW didn't have that. It just felt weird. And even with a virtual audience, it's not the same. And I think that's why wrestling didn't grow. It's not because people weren't smart enough or any of that. It's just wrestling. Can you imagine? I keep going back to the Rolling Stones because I have tickets to the Rolling Stones concert in Minneapolis that I bought a year ago last February. And 2 days after I bought the damn things, the concert was canceled. And every day I get a reminder on my freaking phone that I've got 4 Rolling Stones concert tickets in my file on my phone if the concert ever happens. And
Oh
if
man.
and I tried to call and get my money back, and he said, no, this is we're gonna reschedule. I said, it's a Rolling freaking Stones. Have you looked at them lately? Go to Wikipedia. See how old they are. They may not survive this
Yep.
post-COVID tour schedule. Anyway, I'm sorry, I digress.
No, it's very interesting that you bring that up, Eric. And I'm gonna use the example of hockey because in Canada, that's our religion. So watching hockey, even though I'm so happy that there's something on television, that live sports are back, it's not the same as watching it when there's a full audience in the arena. And you can say that about basketball, even football. There's something that's missing. You can insert that audience noise, but it kind of goes back to the Eric Bischoff formula, the element of surprise, anticipation, when that's not organically there. And in many cases in professional wrestling, that formula is just not there in 2021 or even in 2020. A lot of storylines are either rushed. A lot of storylines may have great beginning, middle, and then the ending is kind of like a dud. Prime example, Kenny Omega, John Moxley with that barbed wire match, where you remember the great build up to it, but that very end with the explosion and everyone just kind of got turned off by it in many ways. It's really true what you say about the lack of people and audiences. And here's to hoping that sometime this year or even next year, we can get back to somewhat of a normality with the audience because they play a big part in the industry of professional wrestling.
Well, I'm looking forward to this year's WrestleMania for selfish and obvious reasons. But I'm also looking forward to it because last year's WrestleMania, I watched both nights of it on my computer and no crowd. And it was the
Yeah.
most unnerving feeling I've ever had. It was just like so wrong. And I want to back up for a second. I don't know if this is true or not. I was told one time that Elvis Presley once said in an interview, and I should probably do some work and find this quote if indeed it was true. But whether it's true or not, I think it's really important. It's something that I carry around in my head all the time. The most important part of any of Elvis Presley's live concerts, in his opinion, was the crowd.
Yeah.
Because if he could energize the crowd, if he could connect to the crowd and then manipulate, and when I say manipulate, that's a word that's often used in a detrimental way or a derisive way, but manipulate the emotion of that crowd so that you bring them to a crescendo and you get them to the point where they're losing their minds because they're loving the time that they're having. That's what, that's the connection, I think, between an artist and an audience, whether the artist is Elvis Presley or Kenny Omega. It's the same freaking thing.
Yeah.
But without that crowd, man, you're not connecting to anything. You're just going out there and doing it. And if indeed it's true that the audience is the most important part of any form of entertainment, then I'm looking forward to WrestleMania because there's going to be 25,000 people in the arena on Saturday night and Sunday night. And I can't wait for the first time in a year to not only be a fly on the wall and see it and experience it, but to have whatever amount of time I get out in front of that crowd just to wave and say goodbye is going to be a magical moment for me. And I think for a lot of the performers who really, really miss performing in front of a lot of crowd.
Absolutely. And let's dive into that. You were announced as one of the latest inductees into the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2021. Eric, that's a long time coming for any true wrestling fan. They know your impact in the industry. How does it feel to finally get the call to go into the Hall of Fame?
It's hard. I can't describe it, Talal. I thought I would be able to. I'm not going to lie. Every year about this time for the last 8 or 10 years, my social media blows up. So, are you going into the Hall of Fame this year? You should be there. Blah, blah, blah. So I can't honestly say the thought has never crossed my mind. It has every year at this time for the last 10 years. But when it has crossed my mind, and I allowed myself to think, God, I wonder what that will be like. Not is it going to happen or not? I would always go, God, how would I react to that? And I knew how I would react. I knew I would be proud. I knew I would be excited. I knew that I would be grateful. Those are kind of things that I try to recognize and be aware of in the course of every day. So I knew that those feelings would be there, but I had no idea how overwhelming those feelings would be. It's a little life-changing for me And part of it is I'm a guy who's been a heel antagonist character my entire television career. I've never been
Yep.
the protagonist or the babyface. I've always been the guy everybody wanted to kick the shit out of. And to all of a sudden wake up one morning and not only being told publicly, that I'm going to be in the Hall of Fame, but the outpouring of support that happened after it was a first-time experience for me. And I never would have guessed how overwhelming that feeling would become.
And how fitting is it that you get to go in with your NWO brothers? You're one of the biggest creations in the history of professional wrestling. How excited are you to get the band back together?
I'm excited, and I'm excited for all of them. Those guys are my brothers. I love them all. And how could I have remained? We've been friends. We've been very close friends longer than we worked in wrestling together, and I'm proud of that, by the way. And I say that, I mean, because it's hard to keep friends in the wrestling industry.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to get friends in life. We all go our separate ways. We all get caught up in different things. We all move to different parts of the country. It's hard to stay tight with someone. And I've been able to stay tight with Hulk. And it's always important to me to see him get the recognition that he deserves, as well as Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. I've gone, those guys, I admire them both so much. Scott Hall, I admire him in different ways, in important ways, more than I admire a lot of people. I look up to Scott Hall and Sean Waltman. And so I'm as happy for them. I'm happier for them than they are.
Oh, that's amazing. It's going to be a great weekend coming up. As you wrap up with the great Eric Bischoff, it is now time for a segment I like to call the final act. Eric, we're going to ask you a series of rapid fire questions about your likes, your dislikes. We're going to give you 1 minute to get through as many of them as you can. If you go over the time.
Have you ever listened to my podcast, dude?
83 weeks. Check it out. If you go over the time, it's all good. But hey, this is Eric Bischoff we're talking about. This is the guy that spits out things. We're gonna go for it. You up for the challenge?
I'm gonna stay out of the weeds. All right, here we go.
Movies or TV shows?
Movies.
Theater or watch at home?
Theater.
Favorite movie?
Tombstone.
Does pineapple belong on pizza?
Fuck no.
Amen to that. Favorite WCW original?
WCW original? Oh, wow.
Homegrown talent.
Bill Goldberg.
One thing WCW had that WWE still doesn't.
Me.
Did Goldberg's streak end too soon?
No.
Bigger WTF moment to deal with? Warriors debut or Jeff Hardy Victory Road?
Warriors debut. I was stuck in the middle of that 30-minute nightmare. Have you ever been in a nightmare where you're in a freaking nightmare and you're trying to wake yourself up, but you can't? You know it's a nightmare. It's not really happening, but you can't wake up. That was me during the Ultimate Warrior 28-minute and 47-second promo where I thought I was on a train to hell.
Oh boy. That's going to be a whole nother topic for a whole nother podcast. Most underrated current WWE wrestler.
Underrated WWE wrestler, Dolph Ziggler.
Most underrated AEW wrestler.
This is going to sound funny to some, but I'm talking macro here, buddy. Do I have minutes? Do I have some time left on my 1 minute clock?
Forget the clock.
Fast.
Let's go for it. Let's hear it.
Okay, I think Cody Rhodes is going to be a bigger star than anybody can imagine at this point. Not that he's not already getting a lot of attention. He does, and he deserves it, but just wait to see what's under or below the tip of the iceberg that we can currently see. Boom!
Some name dropping, some cool facts, some hidden mystery there. All right, Cody Rhodes. One thing about Vince McMahon that surprised you when you finally met him?
His heart.
If you can create a modern day NWO with any three wrestlers across any wrestling promotion, who would those three be?
Not going there.
All right, we'll cut that one out. Word association. Tony Khan,
Exciting.
Roman Reigns,
Powerful.
Kenny Omega,
Cutting edge. Is that two
Mongo
words?
Mc. We'll take it. We'll take it about this one. Mongo McMichael.
Just a great dude.
All right, we'll take that. NXT.
Smart.
Is there a Wednesday Night War currently?
It's a joke.
All right. And lastly, WCW.
An important part of my life that I'm very grateful for.
Bam. We got through all the questions. Forget the time. I love the candid and honest answers. Eric, you're great at that, man. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today. And more importantly, thank you for your contributions to the creative arts, film and television. And me personally, pro wrestling shaped me as to who I am today. It inspired me to follow my dreams in the content creation world. I owe that largely due to you, Eric. Your inspiration, just things that you were creating at the time were so cutting edge. I'm so looking forward to what the future holds for Eric Bischoff. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say this. I don't think the world of professional wrestling is done with Eric Bischoff just yet.
All right, my man. I want to thank you. Thank you so much, Talal. And for those your listeners who don't know this, yours truly botched up my schedule yesterday, and I stood Talal up, and he was kind enough to let me do a make good today. So thank you very much for your patience and understanding. I meant no disrespect to you or your audience, and I really had fun talking to you. And if you ever want to do this again and you don't reach out to me, I'll be thoroughly disappointed.
All right, we got that. Eric, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to doing this again. I wish you all the best and have a wonderful time during WrestleMania weekend.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate it very much.